Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined on Blogging Heads TV. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Phoebe Maltz Bovy. Phoebe, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. So I teach French at the University of Toronto, and I wrote a book called that has nothing to do with French, called The Perils of Privilege, which came out in 2017 with St. Martin's Press.
Uh, Thanks for coming on today. I think you've been on Culturally Determined enough times to be an official friend of the show. So our topic today is going to be mainly Philip Roth, who passed away at the age of 85 last week. We both wrote pieces in reaction to his death, so we thought we'd get together and discuss those pieces and just him more generally and the way that people have reacted to his death. What did you think when you saw that he had passed away?
I was sad because I think, like everybody who, I guess we both read most, I don't know if you've read all, I've read most, I'd say, of his books.
I have read all. I have to say, I have.
Oh,
I have
wow.
read them all.
Okay. All right. Well, as a Roth amateur, I always, on some level, secretly hoped I'd meet him, and I hoped he'd win the Nobel Prize also.
Mm-hmm.
It just seems sad, that he hadn't, and it always seemed like he was about to, well, except then it sort of seemed a little less like he was. But yeah, it just seemed very like the end of an era in some way. Obviously, he didn't, he didn't die at 20. It's not sad in the way it would have been if that had happened, but it was still sad. Yeah, I was still sad. And it certainly made me think about him again. I hadn't read anything by him since maybe 2008 or so. I'm not sure. So it seemed like the moment to think about him again. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, when I saw it, I was, there was a moment of shock, but then he's 85 years old. There was a piece in a profile of him in the Times just like 3 or 4 months ago that portrayed him as still totally with it and in fine health. And so that was kind of my first thought. I was like, oh man, this must have come on quickly. But when you're over 80, these things can happen quickly. And yeah, I saw the Times, I think one of the Times critics said it was the end of an era in the same way that Picasso's death was the end of an era. He was kind of the last of the huge mid-century male, at least authors. Some of the, Toni Morrison is still with us. She was, I don't know if we'll call her mid-century. She was more like 70s is when she
That could
started.
still be mid-century though, 70s.
Yeah,
It's before we were born, I guess. So,
that's true.
yeah.
And he's my favorite writer. And I wrote a piece for the Weekly Standard
A
about
great piece. I really liked it.
Oh, thank you. Which we'll link to below about what I thought he'd be remembered for, and a couple kind of biographical quirks that we share. One is that he was born and grew up in Newark, New Jersey, in a neighborhood called Wequahic, which was a overwhelmingly Jewish neighborhood in the 30s and 40s, and I grew up in a suburb of Newark called South Orange, where a lot of Jews who left Newark moved to South Orange after the war. And so I always felt, I knew some of the places that he wrote about, and some of his characters would live in South Orange or Maplewood, the town next door to it. Once they had kind of achieved a certain level of prestige, they got out of Newark. So yeah, I always felt a and I'm Jewish and a man, obviously, so I always felt like a biographical affinity with him.
Would you feel that when you were reading his books, would you feel like you recognized not just the names of the places and stuff, but did it seem like culturally spot on to you?
In some ways, I mean, the Newark of his childhood is like a vanished world, and that all the Jews left Wequahic, and as far as I know, it's a predominantly African American neighborhood now. So the stuff from his childhood, Plot Against America, and other descriptions of Newark before World War II are like a vanished world. I think there was something in the sensibility, the kind of Weisenheimer sensibility of like the greater New York City area, but also Zuckerman moves to Manhattan and stuff like that, but it's always like Newark is like way in the shadow of, like, it's not even one of the outer boroughs. It's way far below New York City in terms of the like cultural pecking order. the greater New York City area. So it's an afterthought, and that's often the way that the northern New Jersey suburbs are treated. There's like a joke that my cat is going to make a cameo very soon. There's a joke that someone from northern New Jersey will introduce themselves to someone at a party and they'll say, where are you from? And they'll say, oh, I'm from New York City. And they'll be like, oh, where exactly? I said, well, I'm actually from New Jersey. So
this is true. This is true. I'm from New York City. I lived briefly in New Jersey, but I can attest to that happening.
So there was I think there was kind of a local pride in the fact that the area had produced such a great novelist who wrote so often about the area. Yeah,
that makes sense. So you first read him in college, is that right?
Yeah, I had it seems like a lot of people picked him up in high school, and for some reason I never did. But I had a favorite professor who taught the intro to English lit class, American lit class that I took. And in a subsequent year, he was teaching a class on Roth and Updike. So since I didn't know anything about either of these authors as a 19-year-old, I got Portnoy's Complaint from Barnes & Noble and The Poorhouse Fair by John Updike, which is, I think, his first novel. Move the cat out of the way. And when you're reading Portnoy's Complaint for the first time is a shocking experience because of the crazy vulgarity and also like really hilarious nature of it. And it doesn't seem like for a young person, it doesn't seem like something that should be in a book. Right. So that was like a mental earthquake reading that, and then took the class. You read like 6 more works by him, and I just kept on reading until I finished them all.
Wow.
What was your introduction to him like?
Well, I don't remember how I ended up finding. I don't remember, and I also don't. I think it was probably Goodbye Columbus before Portnoy's Complaint, but it was those two I definitely read first, and I was probably about 15, and I think so. This was some of what I just wrote about, but that Portnoy's Complaint seemed to really distill, and I found it hilarious, and I've reread it since, and I think it is like one of the great books. I don't think there's any doubt. But it just seemed to really distill something I'd already seen in the culture, and even just with people I knew about this notion of sort of the Jewish man repulsed by Jewish women, obsessed with non-Jewish women. Mm-hmm. I didn't have much at 15. I went to a math and science high school. I didn't have much worldly experience of any kind, and I just thought, oh, well, I guess that's how the world works. And it really took like going to college to realize that's not how the world works, actually, and that there's a wide world of people, and they're not all Portnoy, not even all the Jewish ones. But especially, I just hadn't really. It seemed to really be very similar to things I'd seen elsewhere in the culture. But then later, I was very taken with Roth's work, so I did read also a bunch of his other works, but specifically, definitely. I Married a Communist and American Pastoral because I wrote my high school senior thesis on those books.
Oh, really?
It was like, I only remember that it had something to do with sort of the children of intermarriage and how they're treated in those novels.
Yes. And
which ended up being actually very similar in certain respects to my dissertation topic, which had to do with France and the 19th century and years, and obviously wrote it years later, but something about like, how Roth is both accessible but also like makes you think. I guess that's a very sort of vague way of saying what makes him special. But I think for me as a high school student, it was literature I could sort of make something of. Which I really like your cat, by the way.
Oh, thanks. She likes getting into trouble, like moving the camera and so forth.
It's okay. My dog recently hung up on a work phone conversation, so. Yeah, with her paw.
That's pretty good. Maybe I hope Grumpkin, her name is Grumpkin, do not hang up on the skull, please. Yes, that's it. I mean, it's interesting that you were almost like allowed to do a high school assignment on Roth. Like you can't imagine Portnoy ever being assigned.
Well, it wasn't Portnoy specifically. Maybe that helped.
Right.
It was more like the sort of like later and more, oh, my dog's saying hello, later and more serious Roth. I think, although at my high school, they probably wouldn't have minded. Yeah. I don't know. But yeah, I kind of wish I would have maybe encountered some of these books a little older because I was definitely at 15 old enough to understand them, like understand the words, kind of get something out of it. But I don't think I had the distance that would have been maybe helpful to get that this is fiction. These are characters. Yes, it relates to the culture. No, it's not like some sort of doom awaiting me. But yeah.
So why don't we talk about the piece that you wrote, which is on that topic of Roth's women characters or lack of women characters, and you were reacting to. So there's been a lot of articles that came out since Roth's death, and most of them
and
have
before actually some of the about this topic. But yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of stuff when he retired from writing. I think it was
Yeah.
5 years ago. There were a lot of kind of early obituary type things written. But Dara Horn, who's a Jewish American novelist, wrote an op-ed in the Times that was critical of Roth's treatment of women, and you wrote your piece is kind of a response to that.
Yes. So Dara Horn's piece, parts of it I sort of really strongly sort of personally relate to, but the conclusions she came to I really couldn't agree with. So basically she talks about reading specifically Goodbye Columbus, the novella, when she was 15. And both relating to sort of like you to this sort of New Jersey Jewish setting, but also finding the character of Brenda Potemkin, the sort of, to use the derogatory term that would be used, the Jewish American princess character. Although I'm not sure she's completely that cliche because she is supposed to be attractive, which I feel like a Jewish American princess, certainly when I was growing up, would be considered kind of not. But it depends. It depends in which. I did grow up, I grew up in New York City, and there was snobbery about the suburbs in a way, like sort of a snobbery sometimes against people who seemed like they would be wealthier who were in the suburbs, but it would be still a snobbery, a cultural kind of snobbery that I think would be fused with the kind of Jap stereotype. But anyway, back to Dara Horn's piece, basically saying that she didn't relate to this character and that Roth's women characters did not ring true to her, that they didn't seem like real women, and that they seemed sort of like mean-spirited caricatures. And she pointed out specifically, and I'm sure you'll have, much more Shakespeare than I do, but she talked about Shylock as a sort of, at least you get Shylock's perspective, although somebody responded to me about this on Twitter saying that, but it's a play. So you do get people's perspective more in a play. But about Merchant of Venice. But then also, there was some other example, but basically that it wasn't that she felt that Roth was just sort of being stereotypical and negative about Jewish women, but that it was sort of like a literary failing to always focus on sort of the perspective either of himself or of some character clearly demographically and more based on himself. And my feeling was that that's not a literary weakness, that different types of literature are doing different things. And, the ability to, I guess partly because I just taught this book, but I think of something like Madame Bovary. I can read Madame Bovary as a woman and think that rings true. It was not written by a woman. I don't think that means that Flaubert's ability to write a female character is sort of the only type of literary excellence. I think it's like a type of virtuoso skill that can be put towards literary excellence, but I think the ability to, like what you were writing about, the metafiction, all of that, this sort of the ability to interestingly walk the line between fiction and autobiography, the ability to talk about your own really specific situations in a way that resonates with people who may be nothing like you, is also literary talent. And I think, but there are aspects of it that where I agreed with her, which was more just that, yes, it does feel like the American Jewish experience certainly is basically Roth or Woody Allen. And that if you're not demographically like them in some respect, and that could be being a woman, it could be anything else. Like I don't find, like I can relate to this sort of chafing at tradition type thing, but it for me would not manifest itself in chasing Annie Hall, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's about it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of places we can go with this. So like, I think Roth only wrote one novel with a female protagonist, which is his third novel called When She Was Good. The book
That's one I haven't read. Okay.
The book is not very good. I would not recommend it.
Okay.
It's before Portnoy. It's just kind of a standard novel, nothing special about it. I think it's loosely based on he had this awful first marriage to this woman who he met, I think, when he was a student at University of Chicago, and she faked a pregnancy to like entrap him into the marriage, and she was like acted crazy or was mentally ill and refused to give him a divorce, and then she died in a car accident. I think sometime in the like mid '60s. So this book is kind of a fictional biography of her childhood. So it's not about Jews. It takes place in the Midwest, and it's just not very good. So that was it. And he had like major supporting characters in his novels who were women, but never the main character or the narrator.
So I haven't read, again, this is all based on memory, but in the later novels, I remember some very sometimes implausibly attractive and interested in Zuckerman young women.
Yeah.
Which,
so this is kind of like
something that some feminist critics have perhaps picked up on.
Yeah, there was some of that Woody Allen flavor to some of the later work. He wrote this book called The Humbling. That was another one of his very late novels that also was not very good. Wouldn't recommend. But yeah, involves like a 7-year-old man having an affair with a 35-year-old woman. So not realistic.
Well, I'm 34 now, but I'm sure things in a couple months will seem, the 70-year-old men will take on a new glow. Yeah.
So there definitely is that, like that criticism is valid. I remember, and the other, the other thing is, I wrote about this in my piece. His novels, especially after the mid-'70s, were intensely autobiographical. He created this alter ego, Nathan Zuckerman, who appears in about 10 or so novels and who shares a very close biography with Roth. He wrote a book that where he himself was the main character that was essentially nonfiction called Operation Shylock, in which like wacky things happen, and there's someone pretending to be Philip Roth in Israel, who he goes and confronts. So it's like a Dostoevskian like doppelganger plot. But yeah, he was like intensely focused on himself. He wasn't like Shakespeare with exploring totally alien worlds. The Shylock example is interesting because of Operation Shylock, and there was an essay by the Shakespeare scholar Stephen Greenblatt that came out last year that made the case that it's very likely that Shakespeare never actually met a Jewish person in his life, but he still managed to create a character who today we recognize as having some kind of Jewish traits somehow. So his like imagination.
That's interesting, but I guess not so surprising to me. So that's more sort of what my dissertation research was on, and it was certainly, and this was on a later period and in France, but it wasn't uncommon, certainly like in the Enlightenment, for French non-Jews to have never met a Jew, but there was so much literature where Jews appeared that there would have been so much to refer back to. these tropes, kind of.
Yeah. So that, but this
Yeah.
was in like 1600 or 1595.
Right.
So it was
Right.
earlier before there was,
That would make sense. Yeah.
yeah. So Roth did not possess that kind of
No.
imagination or talent. Or also,
No.
like, if we compare to Updike, Updike wrote a lot of books about, like waspy people who are having affairs, but he also wrote these crazy novels like The Coup that takes place in an imaginary African nation. And I think he wrote a book that was set in Latin America, and he wrote a book where people are turning into the gods and goddesses from Greek mythology. So that was like a more capacious kind of inventive intelligence than Roth, who really focused in on his own biography.
Yeah.
And as I said in my piece, not since Hemingway is there an author who is so intensely associated with his own fictional creations.
Right. I mean, I think that's certainly true that other authors sort of left their own heads a bit more, but I do think it underestimates the sort of the literary, both the skill, but also just like the how enjoyable it is. Like, I think if you would read Roth, if everybody would pick up a Roth novel, especially like you said, the later ones, and think, oh, like more about this guy, nobody would buy these books. You know what I mean? Obviously, something comes through. There's something in the way he talks about his own life, the way he wrote about his own life, that can make sense even if you don't personally relate, and it doesn't end up reading as like his diary. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, and he was like, after Portnoy came out, people thought he was Portnoy, and he wasn't Portnoy. He invented Portnoy, and
Exactly.
he's written about his parents were not Portnoy's parents. He said that it
Right.
was loosely based on like the neighbors who lived on the upper floor of his childhood home, but and the character originated through a kind of like a after dinner like skit he would put on for dinner parties, and that's where the voice of Portnoy came from.
That's
But
funny.
people were like, this guy's a sex maniac. But
Well, yeah. I mean, that's, I think, been true. I know that with Balzac, when he was writing, at first it would appear in newspapers, like his novels would appear serialized in newspapers. And I remember learning this in grad school, that people would just assume that this was news stories. They wouldn't assume it was about him necessarily, but they would assume these were just things that had happened. Because there's just, I think readers of fiction don't always quite know what to do with it. But with Roth, though, what I found so striking about, especially with the Dara Horn piece, was that there has been this long now discussion in the literary world, I guess, especially in young adult literature, which I'm not as familiar with, but just about cultural appropriation, who gets to say what, who gets to speak for which group, who can create which sort of characters, sensitivity readers, all of this. So sensitivity readers being that like a publishing house will, or maybe just independently, like I guess the likeliest scenario, probably if a white writer writes about a black character, have a black sensitivity reader read it and make sure things are sensitive, I guess. So this has just been really where literary debates have been sort of for the last few years. And then it just seems so strange to see Roth criticized for writing about exactly the demographic that he could write about from personal experience. And it seemed like had he tried to stray further afield and claimed authority, that would have caused its own issues. You know what I mean?
yeah, that's
And I don't,
that's
and
interesting.
I don't think. I mean, I'm not somebody who thinks that writers have to only write about their own experiences, but it just seemed to me that just sort of take the works for what they are. Don't expect them. I think the problem is more this expectation that if there's anything to say, and I think in a way this owes a lot to Roth's talent, but that if there's anything to say about the American Jewish experience, it's in Roth, or it didn't happen almost. And I think that's more the issue.
Yeah, you made me think of The Human Stain, in which,
Yes.
spoiler alert, there's a character who is a light-skinned African-American man who like passes or crosses over to be accepted as a white man, and
A white Jewish man.
yes, a white Jewish man. So it's it's a little bit of a suspension of disbelief. But these cases do happen. Anatole Broyard is one such person who actually was a friend of Roth's, or an acquaintance at least of Roth's.
I didn't know that.
This happened to. There's a really good memoir by his daughter called One Drop. I think her name is Catherine, but something Boyard and the One Drop. I recommend that, about rediscovering her family's history when she only learns on her father's deathbed that he's actually African American, descended from Creole people in New Orleans. But anyway, I think Roth did catch some flack when he made up this character who crosses racial lines and was writing about someone you didn't know anything about. But yeah, I mean, okay, so you can, when you're writing fiction, you can either write about what you know or imagine other people and put words in their mouth. Like you're crossing some kind of boundary regardless, because you're going outside your own skull. So yeah, I think the whole sensitivity reader thing and all these cultural appropriation arguments is just a weird cul-de-sac that the world of young adult fiction has gone into. I can't imagine a sensitivity reader being appointed for any Philip Roth novels. I don't think it would pass muster.
Who would they be? I mean, it would have to be I don't know. Aside from The Human Stain, which I think almost sort of gets around it by having the protagonist be basically an old Jewish man, but not by this sort of little twist, a little twist there, or like with American Pastoral, it's like a Jewish man who doesn't look like he's Jewish, who can pass as not Jewish, which I would assume Philip Roth, much like myself, could not. You know what I mean? So yeah, little twist, tiny little tweak there, for very important to the plot, but yeah, not straying that much.
But he also, in American Pastoral, he created a young woman who becomes a domestic radical and then joins the Jain, Jain religion. So
that's true.
He did create people who are totally alien, I'm guessing, from anyone he actually knew.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I think he obviously, it's not like, from the very limited amount I've read, Knausgaard with the, have you read these?
No, I haven't read any of those.
Knausgaard's Very Long Struggle. Book upon book of his struggle, where, from what I've read of it, it is literally just like his life, but sort of, walking that line between fiction and autobiography. And it's, I mean, I think Roth, it's definitely fiction. There are characters, but I just wouldn't, I wouldn't go there to figure out what are Jewish women really like, if that makes sense. It's just, I think that's not really, I think the problem is just that there's no equivalent to Portnoy's Complaint written by a Jewish woman. I think certainly in the culture at this point, it's hard to even picture something like that. I mean, I'm thinking this isn't as literary, but like Broad City.
Oh, I was thinking Girls.
Or Girls. Oh, there's such a girls angle here too.
All cultural conversations eventually reach their end with Lena Dunham's Girls. And in the final season, she's like reading one of Roth's novels. I can't remember which one.
Oh, really? Yeah. I never got to the final season of Girls. But Broad City, I think of just because it has this sort of raunchy aspect. It has like the Jewish mother aspect with Ilana's mother's meat. Oh my God, it's so funny. So I think of with Broad City, there's an episode where it's the same episode where they discuss one of the characters. It's the pegging episode, but then so that's Abby. But then Ilana's plot is that she's going with her mother to an underground, like literally under a manhole, and there's discussion of the manhole, obviously, the word, but there's like a designer handbag sale. I guess it's like in Chinatown in New York. And I mean, I'm somebody who's been to a lot of, they were not like this, but I've been to a lot of sample sales, like with my mother in the garment district of New York. Like I could, it was hilarious, but it was also like, it was Jewish women situations, and it wasn't in this sort of like Brenda Potemkin sort of like prissy sort of thing. But yeah, so I think that it does exist, but I also think there's less of a need for that in this generation. Like, I guess we're about the same age as girls and Broad City people. And I don't think there's among secular Jews, at least, as much to rebel against as would have been the case then.
Yeah, and partially because of Roth, of him cracking open the conversation and saying that both, it was like, I guess the way I look at it is like he made it so that Jews are fully part of the American experience by turning them into objects of satire in the way that they could be equally an object of satire as anyone else, because there was this kind of idea that like after the Holocaust, anything that was like bad for the Jews was like one further step into like a second Holocaust, and he caught a lot of flack early on for Goodbye Columbus. The stories, especially the short stories in there, he caught flack from like the local Jewish establishment in Newark, and like B'nai B'rith type people. And he has a story where that takes place in the military, where a like Jewish private tries to use the connection of being Jewish to get a Jewish sergeant to like excuse him from duty. So he's like a shirker, and is portrayed very negatively. And the Jewish sergeant lets it slide one time, and then the guy comes back and does it again, and then he like sends him to the brig or whatever. And this really pissed off a lot of people who thought it was that Roth was like actively harming American Jews by writing about him in this way.
Yeah, I mean, I think so this is something I actually wrote about him a few years ago, or it was like a year ago. Sorry, I'm in my apartment, I don't remember timelines, but because this was when I was at the Forward, I wrote about this, that how weird it is for Roth to be discussed, not inappropriate necessarily, but for him to be discussed as like a white male, sort of like canonical, one of the great white men, when his literature, especially something like Portnoy's Complaint, but and the stories in Goodbye Columbus, really are such identity literature. You know what I mean? Like today, this would be considered like about identity, and like it could be assigned in like Jewish American literature class or something, and just it doesn't make him non-white, but it's certainly like, imagine if Portnoy's Complaint had been written by somebody who wasn't Jewish. Okay, I don't think that's possible, but that's something else. Maybe somebody really, really talented. Actually, Flaubert has this draft that's just like, it would have been just like that. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's, it's just funny to think of somebody who was so like at the time, because people talk about like Roth and Bellow, like this is just some eternal thing that they would be considered like white men writers. Obviously that they were men, yes, but it just seems like they were really like, it was very precarious when they were actually writing, like that they would be considered part of the sort of American mainstream. Yeah. Canadian American, I should say, in Bellow's case. Yeah.
We're not going to solve the are Jews white or are they not white?
I mean, I think those particular, I think there are Jews who are white, and I think Philip Roth was one of them. But I just mean that it's not so much that like the question of was he white or not, but more like this question of literature without the identity component, when it's like that's all there is practically in some of it, or not all there is, but it's so present.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, again, comparing him to Updike, who was a white wasp from Pennsylvania, then moved to Massachusetts, and he wrote, he could write like the Rabbit books, or kind of like the everyman character, because that character had no like racial or ethnic or religious like things that set him apart. At least as far as I remember. I don't remember if he was Catholic or something. I don't think he was. But And then, could Roth write an Everyman thing? I'm thinking, but then, yes, he did write a novel called Everyman that came out about 10 years ago. That was about an unnamed protagonist and all of his lifelong struggles with different illnesses and stuff. And so he did kind of claim the ability to universalize in that way, even though he was going like very particular, just telling the details of this one guy's life. Are there any other Roth areas we should discuss before moving on to our second topic?
I'm Roth out. That's enough Roth.
Okay. But, I remember what my other question was. For someone who hasn't read Roth before and is still somehow listening to this conversation, what book would you recommend that they start with?
I mean, Portnoy. It's just going to draw you in. I mean, it's not necessarily okay. I mean, The Human Stain, I would almost say, if you're interested in these sort of academia, speech, all sorts of topical things, or The Plot Against America for the Trump stuff, or American Pastoral for like a sort of great novel type novel. But yeah, which would your cat recommend?
She's very anti-literature. She'll sit on it sometimes, but that's the extent of it. I would pick, I think, The Ghostwriter, which is the first true Zuckerman novel. It's short. It's really, really good. It's about like the Zuckerman character who's the Roth analog as like a young man who's recently published some stories that have become controversial.
Is this the Anne Frank one?
Yes.
Okay.
And then it ties in with the story of Anne Frank in a strange way. And yeah, it's pretty short. It's like 200 pages. So I think give that one a shot if you're curious, and then probably move on to Portnoy and get like your hair blown back.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna hit one more topic, a controversial topic, whenever this name is mentioned anywhere in the media, and that's Jordan Peterson.
What's his deal?
Yeah, what's up with Jordan Peterson? So you're Canadian.
No, I live in Canada. You live in Canada. I teach at the same university that he does, actually, although our paths have not crossed.
Oh, I didn't make that connection.
I live in the same city that he does, but I mean, I'm American. But yeah, suddenly he's everywhere. I guess I was aware of the phenomenon a little bit before most, just because of the Canadian local news angle. He seems to be, so he's a psychology professor, best-selling advice writer, advice guru.
His latest book is a self-help book, right, called 12 Rules for Life, I think.
And his book before that was, which I have read neither of these books. So the one before that was like long before that and was not anything for like a mass readership, as I understand it. It was like a scholarly book. Yeah,
his first book is called Maps of Meaning, I believe, and yeah, it's a dense tome about reconciling, like Jungian mythology and archetypes with the mythologies of the planet and storytelling and other strange things.
A little less accessible. There probably aren't like 20 copies in every pile so there's the bookstore that's like Barnes and Noble here, Indigo. You walk in and it's just like a wall of Jordan Peterson's 12 rules everywhere.
Right.
So it's the vegan handbags.
So last time I did an episode where I mentioned Jordan Peterson. It was with the writer from Slate, Osita Wanevu, who brought him up because Kanye took a screenshot where he was watching one of his lectures or something, and this is just an offhand reference, but the blogging its commenters picked up on it and really went at us for not knowing where we spoke or whatever, and getting him wrong. And since then I haven't delved into his work at all, but I still feel qualified to comment on him because that's what everyone does online.
Well, I think there's the cultural phenomenon, and then there's the the texts, right, with anybody. And then there's also, he's producing quite a bit of text in interviews and so forth. So I did watch that BBC interview, that the notorious one where he kind of demolished the interviewer who, sort of tried to pin him as a sexist, but didn't really do it very effectively. So that doesn't mean she was in the wrong. It just means she was maybe not the best interviewer. Mm-hmm. And he just he won the debate, as it were, and it was pretty clear. And then there was, that I've read some of the profiles. I have not, I had a long list of novels I wanted to read when the semester was done, and I've been reading novels. But I guess what I think, so I think a few things about the phenomenon, which are completely uninformed by the books. One is that I think his looks enter into it more than people want to admit, because he's a man, so people don't talk about men's looks so much. But I think he has this kind of striking, he's not looks in the same way as Justin Trudeau style looks, but I think it matters. And I think that he looks the part, you know what I mean? He looks the part of this sort of whatever platonic ideal sort of father figure, but a bit glamorous. And certainly I think now that he's making all this money with the Patreon or whatever, that New York Times profiled photos of him with what look like very expensive shoes, I suspect.
I didn't notice the shoes. I noticed his unusual.
And
I noticed his unusual jacket that they pictured him in, that had on the lapels had some kind of detailing or something.
There was a lot going on there. There is a lot of very high-end menswear in Toronto, I think, more than I remember seeing in New York. So who knows? The other more substantive thought I have about him is that he seems to excel at, and I think this is a skill, at sort of plausible deniability. Walking up to the line of saying something really offensive, but not quite saying it, which I think allows him to both thrill the followers who want him to believe that every romantically unpopular guy should get an assigned woman, but also to say, I never said that. How dare you? You're an idiot. You didn't really do a close reading of my 1982 thoughts on, you know what I mean? So, yeah, I think that plausible deniability, it's something I've seen in other works, in actual books, as well as from just quotes of people it's something I remember very much from when I once reviewed this was years ago, the Israel Lobby book, where it seemed like there was often this sort of walking up to the line of saying something, but saying, but we're not saying that. But I think he does it more smoothly, where I think he's able to kind of, walk up. I don't know how intentional it is. There's no way to know that. But I think that's something about his, every time I ever see him quoted, it seems like he's on the cusp, or hear him interviewed, it seems like on the cusp of saying something that is really outrageous, but not quite taking it to the unambiguous place. And I also but my main concern with him isn't so much the he's not very sensitive or something. It's more what is he doing with this? Where is this all going? And partly because I'm in Canada, is he going to be the head of Canada? What, what is this all heading towards? And if it's just him having a nice budget for shopping in this, I live in this neighborhood that has a lot of these stores. If he wants to shop in this neighborhood and buy nice menswear, fine. Does he want to be emperor? Does he want to be a religious leader? Or does he just want to make a lot of money? So those are
he
my.
He just wants to help people, Phoebe.
Then why does he charge him so much money, seeing
That's
as he has
question.
a salary as a tenured professor, which it's enough to live on in this city. It's
Yeah. There's a lot of things I find questionable / objectionable about him. I encourage everyone to read the New York Times profile. We'll link to it. My favorite part of it was that it was in the style section instead of
that was good.
National News. That was just such a perfect decision. And
I was glad you highlighted that, because I thought that was great. Yes, it definitely, it kind of relates to what I was saying about his looks. It shows that it's kind of a trend, and that it's not necessarily a new philosophical movement. It might just be a fad, and that's what people like now, and then next week they'll like something else. Yeah.
And the argument about which is that he's talking about, whenever there's a witch, the witch will live in the swamp. and the witch has to live in the swamp, and there's a reason for that. And then the journalist said, but witches aren't real. And he replied something like, witches are real, wizards are real, and they live in swamps. And everyone was like, witches don't live in swamps. What witch lives in a swamp? So it was just very strange that he was so insistent that both witches are real and they live in swamps when they are not real and they don't live in swamps. They live like on the heath or like in a castle or something.
On a broomstick.
Yeah,
that's how travel.
The Wicked Witch of the West lived in a castle, not in the swamp. So that's the. I think I was joking about this when he first came up, which was that he's kind of like Chauncey Gardner from Being There. Have you ever seen that movie?
I don't know. I haven't.
It's kind of It's kind of like about an idiot savant. Now Peterson isn't an idiot; like he's clearly intelligent. No. But what happens is Chauncey is actually this guy whose name is Chance, and he is a gardener, and he gets mistaken for this. It's played by what is his name? The guy who was in. I'm blanking, but he is mistaken for like a genius, and he says he's very gnomic, kind of simple-minded things. But people are like, "Oh, this is so wise," and he becomes like a national guru just by uttering these like banalities. Yeah. And there's some strong parallels to Jordan Peterson. Yeah. Like he's saying, "Clean up your room," and all these young men are like, "I have to clean up my room. That makes so much sense." It's like your mom.
I felt so moved by that. I wish that this. Like, I could stand to clean my apartment, but I don't find this very, like, meaningful. Like,
moms have been telling sons to clean their room since there were sons in rooms.
Right.
And suddenly this, like, 55-year-old University of Toronto professor says to 23-year-old men, clean your room, and they're like, they can't believe the wisdom of it. So some of it is just this, like, these weird banalities. The Patreon stuff is very concerning. Why does a university professor need $80,000 a month in extra money funded by mostly young men across the world? That doesn't make a ton of sense to me unless he's some kind of grifter.
Which does seem possible. It certainly does. I mean, I think it's partly that he's claiming victimhood status and benefiting from it. And it doesn't mean that there aren't people who hate him. It doesn't mean that there aren't people who misrepresent his views somewhere or whatever. I think it's clearly he knows what is profitable, and I think that's got to be driving certainly some of the decisions he's making, some of the topics he's choosing to emphasize in interviews and so forth. I just wonder where he's going with it, but I don't know. I guess maybe there's. I mean, I think part of I think he does have a more specific angle, let's say, rather than gimmick, a more specific angle, which is the opposite of what everybody else is saying. So everybody else is saying there are structural forces that oppress people for this reason or that reason. He's trying to, while he's doing some of that, like he's sort of touching on that with like the, masculinity is being oppressed or whatever. It's like, no, like your bootstraps, whatever, thinking, sorry, it's very hot in here. Something like with that you should be self-reliant, that you should.
You can't change, you can't fix the world before you fix yourself, that kind of thing.
Right. All of this, which is very different from the sort of obviously you're not calling your senator in Canada, but you know what I mean? It's different from the sort of politically engaged / the world is structurally organized to hurt you type message that I think people are younger people are getting otherwise. So maybe that's it. But I think it's a mistake to kind of conflate him with Trump because I think there's a lot of overlap, but I don't think it's necessarily the same thing. I'm not convinced that it's as much about whiteness or race in general. It might be, but from what I've read, it doesn't necessarily seem to be. It seems to be much more about gender.
Yeah.
It's just unclear where it's going. But I guess what strikes me, though, is that it always seems like it's on the cusp of being over. And then there's another one of these long articles, often brilliantly done, like the New York Times one, which really was. And then it's back, and it seems like it could just kind of be like that was the big book of the season, and then it's gone, and then he's back into obscurity, and except for whichever fans. But I feel like it gets driven by this sort of, he gets taken very seriously, and each time that happens, there's another wave of it. So I don't know if I feel like people who genuinely think he's a huge danger should be like not writing / clicking on the profiles. I'm not convinced I think he might just be a fad. And, but who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, I would say seems more like a fad. I don't know, like, The Secret or something like that, than some kind of lasting thing here. So I mean, something else that he's put out there that annoys me, and I'm guessing that in his work is actually more complicated than this, but in the version that's filtered out into like the places where people post online, he has this dichotomy between male and female order and chaos.
Yes, I don't follow.
And that men represent order and
right.
female represents chaos. Now I'm guessing there's, and like it seems from my limited understanding, in the Jungian archetypes, like there's male and female within all of us and order and chaos within all of us. But the way it seems to be filtering out is like men are order, women are chaos, which is insane. That's the craziest fucking thing I've ever heard in my life.
No, but seriously, like, where does the mess in the men's rooms, because they're young, single men, where does it come from?
It makes no sense.
Their mothers come in and mess up the room.
Every agent of chaos in world history has been a man. It's just totally absurd. It makes no sense at all.
His insistence on sort of gender essentialism, I guess, is meant to be like, well, it's very, I mean, it just puts him right smack in the middle of the culture wars, right? Because it's like this sort of notion on the right that the left is obsessed with saying that gender is obsolete and all of that, which is like this, there's like 3 people on Tumblr who think this, and it's not, yeah, I think it fits with that, like that he's going to defend that like men are men and women are women, which, I mean, obviously, so the way he got fame initially was with this, where he insisted that he would not call his students by their chosen pronouns. I don't know how much this, well, it had to do with some Canadian law about this. I have to say I've been teaching for a while in Canada now, and this has absolutely never come up, and it's even in grammar classes where, in theory, it could. So I don't know how much of this was just an issue he invented. I don't know whether he meant that he wouldn't use they, or whether he meant that he wouldn't use like individually and like created pronouns or what. But the point is that I think regardless of what the actual issue was, it certainly, to make that your thing comes across as insensitive and as that you're trying to kind of make you're trying to make some kind of point about gender and nostalgia. So I think that's how he kind of built his brand on this. And I don't know, yeah.
I mean, in any discussion or debate that involves gender identity, for a straight white man to claim that he's the real victim here because he might have to say they or something, and no one's arresting anyone for not saying they. Okay. This will never happen in world history.
So there are differences. So, okay, here's where I can bring in the Canadian angle. There are differences. There isn't the First Amendment here, and there is some law that I guess you could be fined, as I understand it from a recent Toronto Star thing about this, and to do with Peterson, by a professor who used to be friends with him and now had a falling out with him. It's a very long, I don't know if I don't know. It's kind of interesting in some respects. But basically, yeah, you could be fined for using the wrong pronoun. And more to the point, there was just in the fall or summer or something, there was some controversy where a TA at a different university in Ontario recorded being berated by, and then I guess they had said to her, one of the people, one of her supervisors had said to this TA that she could be arrested or something if she showed a clip of Jordan Peterson talking or something. So I guess there's the perception. I mean, I think the speech issues aren't entirely like a figment of his imagination, but I think at the same time, if it's a question of he, she, or they, and you're refusing to use one of those, because and you're only going to use he or she, I think that's just rude. And it's transphobic also, but it's also just as a teacher, like why do that except to make, I guess, because you earn more on Patreon than from the university. I don't know, or you're, either it's mean spirited or it's, yeah, but yeah, the speech issue is it's there, but it's not what he's claiming it to be, basically.
Okay, that's a good clarification. I guess the last thing was this joke that I put on Twitter, which was that Jordan Peterson is just Marie Kondo for men. Marie Kondo, for those not in the know, wrote this book called The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And she has a method about cleaning your house and cleaning your closet and your drawers. My wife and I did it one time, and we got rid of some stuff. Seemed pretty good.
Did your place stay neat?
No, but we did not adhere to her strict guidelines and so forth. But it was a good way of cleaning out your closet and getting rid of clothes you don't wear anymore.
Well, yeah, it is. I went for it. First of all, yes, he is definitely the Marie Kondo. It's all about cleaning your room, and I read that book, sort of tried to do my socks the way she recommended. I guess it's useful I've moved a lot. Like, my husband and I move around a lot for various academic related reasons. And I've gotten rid of a lot of stuff in the move. So I haven't had to KonMari. That's what it's called. The method is KonMari. Yeah. I think it's similar. It's just they're like, why the political, KonMari got a little criticism too of the like, why shouldn't you love your books, especially where she says to get rid of all your books that you haven't, that don't spark joy. It's like, no, it's like your books. But yeah, the room thing is weird. Maybe there's more context to it. This is where I have to say I have not read this book. Maybe it has something that even Marie Kondo doesn't, and you read it and you're like, that's it. Like, this, what you cannot see of my apartment mess would just totally be solved. So maybe he is a really good cleaning inspirational writer, and I've been selling him short.
Yeah, I'm not going to read the book anytime soon. But people in the comments, I'm sure you think we were wrong about what we said about Jordan Peterson. So let us know.
And please remind us that we have not read the books, because we live in cold climates, but we're having heat-induced hallucinations, and we don't know what we've read. Or should I just? My apartment does not currently have air conditioning or a fan, so who knows?
Oh man,
it's dealt with. There's an air conditioner not set up yet, so But yeah, so let us know in the comments about what we hallucinated. Lobsters, I think, also lobsters.
Yeah, let's not get into the lobster bit. Okay, well,
thanks for having.
Phoebe, thanks for braving the heat and coming on and talking about Philip Roth, a great American writer, Jordan Peterson, a noteworthy Canadian individual, with me. And where can people find more of your work if they're interested?
So most of the freelancing I've done has been for the New Republic. So most of my articles are there. But please read my Roth piece in the Jewish Review of Books, and most of all, my book itself, The Perils of Privilege. Yeah. Yeah,
and we did a Blogging Heads conversation about that book, which you can find in the Blogging Heads archives. And check out my piece in the Weekly Standard about Roth called We Are Here to Be Insulted. Subscribe to the show on iTunes if you wish, or subscribe to Blogging Heads on YouTube. And we'll see you again next time.
Great.